Old Pioneers, Part 2, Chapter 3, Part 2. After dinner, Lou and Oscar went to the orchard to pick cherries. They had neither of them had the patience to grow an orchard of their own, and Annie went down to gossip with Alexandra's kitchen girls while they washed the dishes. She could always find out more about Alexandra's domestic economy from the prattling maids than from Alexandra herself, and what she discovered she used to her own advantage with Lou. On the Divide, farmers' daughters no longer went out into service, so Alexandra got her girls from Sweden by paying their fare over. They stayed with her until they married and were replaced by sisters or cousins from the old country. Alexandra took her 3 nieces into the flower garden. She was fond of the little girls, especially of Millie, who came to spend a week with her aunt now and then, and read aloud to her from the old books about the house, or listened to stories about the early days on the Divide. While they were walking among the flower beds, a buggy drove up the hill and stopped in front of the gate. A man got out and stood talking to the driver. The little girls were delighted at the advent of a stranger, someone from very far away. They knew by his clothes, his gloves, and the sharp, pointed cut of his dark beard. The girls fell behind their aunt and peeped out at him from behind the castor beans. The stranger came up to the gate and stood holding his hat in his hand, smiling, while Alexandra advanced slowly to meet him. As she approached, he spoke in a low, pleasant voice. "Don't you know me, Alexandra? I would have known you anywhere." Alexandra shaded her eyes with her hand. Suddenly she took a quick step forward. "Can it be?" she exclaimed with a feeling. "Can it be that it is Carl Lindstrom? Why, Carl, it is!" She threw out both her hands and caught his across the gate. "Sadie, Millie, run tell your father and Uncle Oscar that our old friend Carl Lindstrom is here. Be quick. Why, Carl, how did it happen? I can't believe this." Alexandra shook the tears from her eyes and laughed. The stranger nodded to his driver, dropped his suitcase inside the fence, and opened the gate. "Then you are glad to see me, and you can put me up overnight. I couldn't go through this country without stopping off to have a look at you. How little you have changed. Do you know, I was sure it would be like that. You simply couldn't be different. How fine you are!" He stepped back and looked at her admiringly. Alexandra blushed and laughed again. "But you yourself, Carl, with that beard, how could I have known you? You went away a little boy." She reached for his suitcase, and when he intercepted her, she threw up her hands. "You see, I give myself away. I have only women come to visit me, and I do not know how to behave. Where is your trunk?" "It's in Hanover. I can stay only a few days. I am on my way to the coast." They started up the path. "A few days? After all these years?" Alexandra shook her finger at him. "See this. You have walked into a trap. You do not get away so easy." She put her hand affectionately on his shoulder. "You owe me a visit for the sake of old times. Why must you go to the coast at all?" "Oh, I must. I am a fortune hunter. From Seattle I go on to Alaska." "Alaska?" She looked at him in astonishment. "Are you going to paint the Indians?" "Paint?" The young man frowned. "Oh, I'm not a painter, Alexandra. I'm an engraver. I have nothing to do with painting." "But on my parlor wall I have the paintings—" He interrupted nervously. Watercolor sketches, done for amusement. I sent them to remind you of me, not because they were good. What a wonderful place you have made of this, Alexandra." He turned and looked back at the wide map-like prospect of field and hedge and pasture. "I would never have believed it could be done. I am disappointed in my own eye, in my imagination." At this moment, Lou and Oscar came up the hill from the orchard. They did not quicken their pace when they saw Carl. Indeed, they did not openly look in his direction. They advanced distrustfully, and as if they wished the distance were longer. Alexandra beckoned to them. "They think I am trying to fool them. Come, boys, it's Carl Lindstrom, our old Carl." Lou gave the visitor a quick sidelong glance and thrust out his hand. "Glad to see you." Oscar followed with, "How do you do?" Carl could not tell whether their offishness came from unfriendliness or from embarrassment. He and Alexandra led the way to the porch. "Carl," Alexandra explained, "is on his way to Seattle. He is going to Alaska." Oscar studied the visitor's yellow shoes. "Got business there?" he asked. Carl laughed. "Yes, very pressing business. I'm going there to get rich. Engraving's a very interesting profession, but a man never makes any money at it, so I'm going to try the gold fields." Alexandra felt that this was a tactful speech, and Lou looked up with some interest. "Ever done anything in that line before?" "No, but I'm going to join a friend of mine who went out from New York and has done well. He has offered to break me in." "Terrible cold winters there, I hear," remarked Oscar. "I thought people went up there in the spring." "They do, but my friend is going to spend the winter in Seattle, and I am to stay with him there and learn something about prospecting before we start north next year." Lou looked skeptical. "Let's see. How long have you been away from here?" 16 years. You ought to remember that, Lou, for you were married just after we went away." "Going to stay with us some time?" Oscar asked. "A few days, if Alexandra can keep me." "I expect you'll be wanting to see your old place," Lou observed more cordially. "You won't hardly know it, but there's a few chunks of your old sod house left. Alexandra wouldn't never let Frank Shabata plow over it." Annie Lee, who, ever since the visitor was announced, had been touching up her hair and settling her lace and wishing she had worn another dress, now emerged with her 3 daughters and introduced them. She was greatly impressed by Carl's urban appearance, and in her excitement talked very loud and threw her head about. "And you ain't married yet? At your age now? Think of that! You'll have to wait for Millie. Yes, we've got a boy, too, the youngest. He's at home with his grandma. You must come over to see Mother and hear Millie play. She's the musician of the family. She does pyrography, too. That's burnt wood, you know. You wouldn't believe what she can do with her poker. Yes, she goes to school in town, and she is the youngest in her class by 2 years. Millie looked uncomfortable, and Carl took her hand again. He liked her creamy skin and happy, innocent eyes, and he could see that her mother's way of talking distressed her. "I'm sure she's a clever little girl," he murmured, looking at her thoughtfully. "Let me see. It's your mother that she looks like, Alexandra. Mrs. Bergson must have looked just like this when she was a little girl. Does Millie run about over the country as you and Alexandra used to, Annie?" Millie's mother protested. "Oh, my, no. Things has changed since we was girls. Millie has it very different. We are going to rent the place and move into town as soon as the girls are old enough to go out into company. A good many are doing that here now. Lou is going into business." Lou grinned. "That's what she says. You better go get your things on. Ivar's hitching up," he added, turning to Annie. Young farmers seldom address their wives by name. It is always you or she. Having got his wife out of the way, Lou sat down on the step and began to whittle. "Well, what do you folks in New York think of William Jennings Bryan?" Lou began to bluster, as he always did when he talked politics. "We gave Wall Street a scare in '96, all right, and we're fixing another to hand them. Silver wasn't the only issue." He nodded mysteriously. "There's a good many things got to be changed. The West is going to make itself heard." Carl laughed, but surely it did do that, if nothing else. Lou's thin face reddened up to the roots of his bristly hair. "Oh, we've only begun. We're waking up to a sense of our responsibilities out here, and we ain't afraid neither. You fellows back there must be a tame lot. If you had any nerve, you'd get together and march down to Wall Street and blow it up. Dynamite it, I mean, with a threatening nod." "Dynamite it, I mean," with a threatening nod.